Hello, my name is López Varela. I am professor at Universidad Madrid, Spain. And I'm very happy to be talking to you today as part of the Eurasia Foundation program organized by Professor Wang at Rutgers University. Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and I'm going to be talking today about thinking with and through things, in Ezra Pound's poems, Joyce's Ulysses, and Tom McCarthy's rewriting of Joyce in Mermaid Figurine. What I'm going to explore in this paper is intermediality, focusing on the idea of thinking, which is to consider the value associated to objects by means of storytelling, the ways in which humans infuse life and meaning into inanimate things. I'm going to consider James Joyce's Ulysses because it's the centenary, and explore the relations between Ezra Pound, Joyce's work, and also the impact of Joyce on a microstory written by British novelist Tom McCarthy for the project Significant Objects. McCarthy's Mermaid Figurine is brings back echoes from two of the episodes in Ulysses, Proteus and Sirens, and it projects them onto our contemporary landscape in order to show how little things and insignificant objects can gain significance by means of a non-anthropocentric narrative. So this is the focus on thinking, which is connected to intermediality, and it's also connected to the post-human paradigm. Regarding the methodological framework that I'm going to be using, I'm going to be using the basis of material engagement theory as established by Lambros Maraforos, professor at Oxford University, who uses extended mind approaches together with semiotics and belief on science being enactive, as well as material agency, as you can see there, and the idea that things are consubstantial, continuous and coextensive parts of minds in action. This is the extended mind. That things have a causal efficacy in human thought and action. This is material agency. And things are, as material signs, bring forth, rather than simply represent, preform concepts or images. So they bring forth new forms of signification and semiosis. And this is the idea of enactivism. So the research is grounded on neo-materialist approaches, which are also at the heart of the post-human debate, and which is an ongoing discussion that contemplates the possibility that agency is distributed beyond humans. Neo-materialism has acquired renewed importance because of two concurrent circumstances. On the one hand, the rapid development of digitalization and cybernetic machines, and the growing concern for the environment, mainly due to the consequences of global warming. So in both cases, new forms of symbiosis are enacted from the encounters between the human and the non-humans, with emergent and unexpected effects. For example, the pandemic. So this should extend the debate on intermediality. Among the different authors who are working on this new post-human paradigm or non-human paradigm are, for example, Wendy Wheeler in her book The Whole Creature, where she claimed that meaning making is a biosemiotic process that involves not just culture but also phenomenological aspects and material aspects. No, according to Wheeler, organic and non-organic matter have porous borders and is informed by a sort of drive to establish contact and communication with the rest of the world. This dynamics engages all beings from the humblest forms of single cell life upwards, she says. And this transit across bodies has also been labeled by Stacia Limo transcorporeality in her book Bodily Natures, and Jane Bennett has termed it vibrant materiality in her book 2010 book. From the perspective of material engagement, Malaforis insists that we have a plastic mind, which is inextricably intertwined with the plasticity of forms around us, so that things actively participate in human cognitive life. And human thinking is better described as thinking, he says. No, we think with and through things, not simply about things. And his book, also How Things Shape the Mind, is an interesting read. So one of the first scholars to recognize that bodies are semiotically active was Donna Haraway in When Species Meet in 2007. And more recently, Serenella Iovino and Sergio Opperman are talking about the fact that the world takes the form of signs, again, semiotics, which are inscribed in different forms of matter, and that these signs can be translated into human languages as act of self-expression. So to quote Haraway again, every being that matters is a congeries of its formative histories, in the way that it joins text and body in material semiotics and semiotic materiality, so that in the course of time, materiality is punctuated by meanings becoming storied matter. So the entanglements between human and non-humans, including ecosystems at large, can be read as text that might express nature's responses to human exploitation, for example, and even unintended interventions leave traces that speak back to humans. No? For example, as I mentioned, the pandemic. No? So several issues are brought to the fore here. First is the question of events in the world exceeding human intentionality and human agency, perhaps gathering potentials that are inherent in specific material situations, implicating and complicating them in their unfolding. And this is what has been termed enactivism. And there's also the issue of how intermediate studies is involved in the whole discussion, and the possible scaling of agentive capacities. Because after all, intermediality, as defined by Lars Elstrom, involves the combination of biological perceptual modalities enhanced by technical media combination, as qualified by sociocultural requirements in a particular spatiotemporal span. So the research question is, can intermediality be brought further out of bounds to interrogate interrelations between human and non-humans, subjects and objects, animate and inanimate, active and inert? So I'm going to look at this question through the three authors that I mentioned earlier on, Ezra Pound, looking at his poems, some of his poems and some of the poems he translated from Chinese. So a little bit about his biography. Pound arrived in London in 1908. He was an American. He began to teach at Regent Street Polytechnic, which is now the University of Westminster. And he spent many mornings reading in the British Museum. And then had lunch at the Vienna Cafe on Oxford Street. And there he met two important writers of the time, Wyndham Lewis and Ford Madox Ford. He also frequented a literary salon where he met novelist Olivia Shakespeare, who later became his mother-in-law. And through her, he was able to get to know and mix with the cream of London literary circle, which included George Bernard Shaw, Huon, Catherine Mansfield, H.G. Wells, W.B. Yeats, who was at the time Olivia Shakespeare's lover. Pound also worked for a journal, a socialist journal called The New Age, and it was hired to write a weekly column, and he later became secretary to W.B. Yeats. At the British Museum, he was introduced to East Asian artistic concepts by poet and historian Lawrence Pinion, and he became very interested in Japanese and Chinese art and aesthetics. He was looking for a minimalist language to write poetry, and of course Japanese verse was inspiring. He later was introduced to Ernest Fenollosa's work by his widow, who sent him some manuscripts which he would edit and publish. And I will mention this later. So the literary magazine Poetry, magazine of verse, which had been founded in Chicago in 1912 by Harriet Monroe, published Pound's haiku-like famous poem In a Station of the Metro in 1913. So haikus, as you know, are traditional Japanese nature poems of 17 syllables. Pound's haiku has 19, and so it's a little bit different from the Japanese. But he describes a moment in the underground metro station in Paris. The poem contains only 14 words without any verbs, so the movement is captured by the visual layout of the poem, and also by the words that are used. In the ABC of reading, Pound claimed that the poem was meaningless unless one had drifted in a certain vein of thought. No, so one has to become the traveler in the metro to feel the movement conveyed in the poem. The poem goes on. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet blank bough. So some critics have mentioned that the poem may have been inspired by Suzuki Harunobu painting, A Woman Admiring Plum Blossoms at Night, which is at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. In any case, as we have mentioned, it focuses on the economy of language, precision of imagery, and the experimentation with non-traditional Western verse form, in this case, the incorporation of Eastern forms and aesthetics. No? In a later book, which Pound published in 1916, he explained, and I quote, that he was trying to record a precise instant when a thing, outward and objective, transforms itself or darts into a thing, inward and subjective. So this emphasis on thingness, on how things that are perceived become an emotion. No? And so the full quotation, it's in this paragraph. 3 years ago in Paris, I got out of a metro train at La Concorde, and I saw suddenly a beautiful face, and then another, and another, and then a beautiful child's face, and then another beautiful woman. And I tried all that day to find words for what this had meant to me, and I could not find any word that seemed to me worthy or as lovely as that sudden emotion. And that evening, as I went home along the Rue Reynaud, I was still trying and found suddenly the expression. I do not mean that I found words, but there came an equation, not in speech, but in little splotches of color. It was just that, a pattern, or hardly a pattern, if by a pattern you mean something which with a repeat in it. But it was a word, the beginning for me of a language in color. So that evening I realized quite vividly that if I were a painter, or if I had often that kind of emotion, or even if I had the energy to get paints and brushes and keep at it, I might found a new school of painting that would speak only by arrangements in color. So he goes on to talk about form in the same publication. Focuses again on thingness. No, every concept, every emotion presents itself to the vivid consciousness in some primary form. It belongs to the art of this form. So notice the emphasis on the materiality. No, and he wants to go to the minimal form. No, he says one is tired of ornamentations. They are all a trick, and any sharp person can learn them. And so he goes on to praise the Japanese for they have understood that beauty is a sort of knowing. And he says, a Chinaman said long ago that if a man cannot say what he has to say in 12 lines, he had better keep quiet. The Japanese have evolved the still shorter form of the haiku, no? And he quotes two haikus, one from Arakida Moritake, the fallen blossom flies back to its branch, a butterfly. And another one, the footsteps of the cat upon the snow, plum blossoms. So this emphasis on thingness is present in his poems, but also in the poems that he translated for his volume Kathai. So we mentioned that Ernest Fenollosa, widow, sent Pound his manuscripts, Fenollosa's manuscripts. Fenollosa was an Orientalist from Harvard who had become the first American professor at the University of Tokyo. And while he was working at the British Museum, he suffered a heart attack and died. No? He was in charge of a large collection of Japanese and Chinese art, and all the manuscripts were unpublished. So his widow sent them to Pound, and he first published them serialized in the Little Review in 1919 under the title The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry. And it was later published in book form in 1936. No? And the book studied the origin and pictorial nature of Chinese ideograms. We will see that there was some controversy here about the nature of the Chinese ideograms. The inspiration from Fenollosa formed the basis for the volume Kathai, in which Pound included 15 poems, which were his first experiments in translating Chinese poetry. And we're going to look at one of the poets, who Pound names Li Pu or Rihaku, but in China is known as Li Bei. We will see later this poem, The Jewelster's Grievance. But first I want to mention how the conception of ideographic writing that Fenollosa and Pound had has been criticized by Chinese scholars. And I give two examples. One is Shang Longxi, who explains that, and you have a quotation there, that contrary to popular misconceptions, Chinese writing is not pictographic or ideographic, because the characters are linguistic signs of concepts and represent the sound and meaning of words rather than the pictographic representations of things themselves, he says in Mighty Opposites. And also Junte Huang says that the emphasis on the pictorial and not so much on the phonetic are aspects that Fenollosa and Pound took as the main feature of Chinese ideograms, but they may have come by way of the interpretation associated to the Japanese way of understanding these characters. Because at the time, to read Chinese, there was a method that called wakon in Japanese, and this method consisted in inserting marks on the margins of the Chinese text to visually separate the ideograms. So according to Huang, this may have created an imperfect form of reading Chinese, depending on the visual aspects, no? And then he adds that I suppose that Fenollosa and Pound would go on to promulgate the visualness of the Chinese characters at the expense of the phonetic based on this, no? He goes on to add, it then becomes clear that what has always seemed to be a misreading by Fenollosa and by Pound is actually attributable to a peculiar style of translingual interpretation practiced by Japanese scholars. So these are some of the problems that we encounter when exploring aesthetics and also translating from one language to another when languages are so different as Eastern and Western languages. No? A similar approach as the one developed by Fenollosa and Pound was happens also in Jerome McGann's Black Riders, The Visible Language of Modernism, where he's going to explore how modernist styles are related to graphic and typographic design. And McGann also sketches the impact of Eastern aesthetics on modernist writing and design, based on this idea of the visual and the pictographic, So looking at Li Bei's poem in Katai, the Jewelster's Grievance, and we will see that this has been translated differently in recent years, just let me read the poem to show how the focus is again on things, The jewel steps are already quite white with dew. It is so late that the dew soaks my gauze stockings, and I let down the crystal curtain and watch the moon through the clear autumn. This was Pound's free translation, In any case, we can see the emphasis on the moon, which is one of the characteristics of Li Bei's poetry. The moon represents the Syrian landscape and also the sublime in connection to the dwellings of the Xian, the immortals. And also, Pound offers a brief paragraph in which he tries to explain the choice of words in his translation, and he emphasizes the aspect of a visual perception. The reader has to see beneath the poem's perfect glossy surface. The other scholars have translated this poem as Jade Staircase Lament, and it's supposed to be a celebrated example of Wuyang Yueju, belonging to a genre known as Gongjuan or court lament. The speaker of the poem uses transitory images and dew, the jade stairs, and autumn moon to evoke a melancholic and elegiac mood. And David Hinton, in his 2008 translation, offers a slightly different interpretation to the poem's mood, setting, and temporality. This is a translation by Hinton. Night long on the jade staircase, white dew appears, soaked through gauze stockings. She lets down crystalline blinds, gazes out through jewel lacework at the autumn moon. So you can see that you can discuss with your professor the original Chinese and the two translations that have been offered here. See which one is more suitable. So we move on now to James Joyce and his relation to Ezra Pound. We have mentioned that in 1913, Pound became the literary editor of The Egoist, a journal founded by the suffragette Dora Marsden, and he was also W.B. Yeats' secretary. So on his suggestion, Yeats encouraged Pound to publish James Joyce's work. He invited Pound to accompany him to his cottage, a stone cottage in Sussex. And during this visit, he introduced Pound to Joyce's collection of poems, chamber music. So Pound wrote to Joyce to invite him to publish in The Egoist. And Joyce gave permission to publish the poem I Hear an Army. Also, he sent him the collection of short stories, Dubliners, and the first chapter of his novel, Portrait of the Artist. And Pound wrote back that this was damn fine stuff. He liked the novel. No? Finally, another one of the editors, Harriet Shaw Weaver, who later became Joyce's economic supporter, accepted a Portrait of the Artist for The Egoist, where it was serialized starting in 1914. And you have there one of the pictures from the serialization of the artist of the Portrait of the Artist. So let's look a little bit about in the question of thingness in Joyce's Ulysses in particular. We have mentioned. Let's look briefly at the portrait, and then we move on to Ulysses. So, Joyce is one of the authors who, for example, like Lewis Carroll, he was playing with the notion of explanation and the cause-effect relations related to human language. And like Ezra Pound, he was paying particular attention to things and to the fact that perception contributes to different states of mind. So the character of Stephen Dedalus, who is Joyce's alter ego in A Portrait of the Artist, and later also in Ulysses, through this character, Joyce is exploring visual and acoustic forms of perception and their relation to memory and remembrance. And he's trying to frame special moments of what he called epiphanic revelation, no? Which are very similar to Ezra Pound's idea of the vortex, which Pound conceived at a point of maximum energy. And you need to look at the idea of vorticism, British vorticism. So in A Portrait of the Artist, Stephen's aesthetic theory is an attempt to understand the dialectic between the multiplicity of parts and how they conform unity, that the unity of things that he describes as using Thomas Aquinas' philosophy, quidditas, the whatness of the thing. And in Ulysses and in Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's experimentation becomes much more radical, and he begins to fracture words, creating a kind of hybrid language where meanings multiply and words acquire a life of their own. No? And here we can see Joyce's experimentation breaking with the traditional humanistic representational view, no? Where an internal mental representation or idea precedes the making of something. So, in other words, we have examples of thinking, how we think with and through things, no? So this happens in particular in two episodes, in the Proteus episode and the Sirens episodes, which are the ones that we're going to be mentioning here. And we can claim that these episodes are trying to give a voice to things in perception. No? So insignificant things, inanimate things, become significant. And they become associated to a memory and a story with a strong emotional impact. No? So what happens in the Proteus episode? Well, we have Stephen Dedalus opening the episode with these words, ineluctable modality of the visible. Soon enough, he's walking on the beach in Dublin, and in the episode, he closes his eyes to inquire into the relationship between visual perception and thought. And he looks at things, and he interprets things as signs, no, as signatures of all things that I'm here to read. See pawn, sees pawn, see ragged, the nearing tide, the rusty wood, snot green, blue, silver, rust, color signs. So these are some of the things that he sees around the beach, but also he, as you can see, he makes these compound words, which are particular. He creates these new words in which the mixture of several words together multiply meanings. No, so during his walk, well, he sees a boot, he sees a bottle, he sees a number of objects. No, the whole episode involves great philosophical ideas, very deep philosophical ideas coming from various sources, including Plotinus, Jacob Boheme, and Bishop Berkeley. And of course, I don't have time to go into a lot of detail here. But these sources, these precursors, are interrogating themselves about sense of perception, and they are also inquiring, like Ezra Pound was doing, how things are read in a subjective way, and if so, are they unreliable? So as he walks, we were saying, he closes his eyes to experiment in the dark, and he also explores rhythm, no sound. He to hear his boots crushing, crackling rock and shells, and so he considers rhythm in relation to space and time, and he says that he is. I am a stride at a time, a very short space of time through very short times of space. So he's part of this nature, this ongoing larger nature, where some things are much longer, last longer than he does. For example, the sun in the beach, the sea, mountains, and so on. They are things that are there before we arrive. No. So Stephen sees himself as occupying a momentary position in a much larger flux of life, a little bit like Heidegger's Dasein, I'm here in a particular moment, and this nature waits against his limited temporality. He later opened his eyes to see pieces of sea wreckage and crackling mast. He sees part of a boat, razor shells that cut his boots, a pocket of seaweed, a beer bottle, half buried in the sand, a dead dog, a carcass, not the bones of a dead dog, and a live dog who is walking in the beach with his owners, and he's called Tatters, and he's running to dig out the dead dog. So he's looking at all these things, and is making him. All these things are causing him to think about death. And he considers death in relation not only to physical death, but also to the death of creativity and of the death of his visibility as an artist. He wants to be visible to achieve social visibility and fame and money. And he thinks that without this visibility, he's dead. So in reflecting about all these things, he realizes that the subject's gaze is always already inscribed in the perceived object itself. In other words, we always have a subjective approach to looking at the things around us. No, every person sees things differently, and so in a way, it's almost like a way of writing. No, that's why he compares the field of vision to the blank slate of the mind, to be filled with perceptions that turn into memories. And again, the quote, no, the signatures of all things I'm here to read. No, and this is a title, in fact, from Jacob Boehme, who is one of the authors I mentioned that it's inspiring him. So, as I have just mentioned, the dead dog, the shipwreck that he sees, he's also afraid of water. Stephen is afraid of water. All this appears in connection to his feelings of dead ambition, no? And we have a quotation here that's very clear in this regard, no? I throw this ended shadow from me. He's like a shadow in the sun, no? It's in the morning, actually. Man shape ineluctable, call it back, endless. Would it be mine, form of my form? So he's thinking about this thingness of his own body, his body as a thing, no? Who watches me here? Whoever anywhere will read these written words, signs on a white field. So he's questioning, whether he's going to have some visibility. Is anybody going to read what his signs, the signs that he's going to leave behind, not just what he writes, but even the footprints on the sand, no, as he walks, no? So although all the reflection in Joyce's has no ecological connotations, we can see this the emphasis on thinking through things, no, and on material perceptions, how the different things and people that he encounters are impacting the way he's thinking. So I have a quotation here from Michael Bloomsfield related to sustainability, no? And he says that things that can unsettle the privileged stability of lyric or narrative persona and stew teleological thinking, exploring otherness and reflecting and engaging new vocabularies. This is exactly what happens in the Proteus episode. Things are unsettling Stephen. They're unsettling his persona, his psychological and physical identity, and they open the door to otherness, to considering not only new vocabularies, but thinking beyond the human, no, which is what we're claiming here. So even though Joyce is not talking about green humanities, but his language creates these openings, no? And this is something that also Slavoj Zizek has actually recognized in the parallax view. The term parallax owes much to Joyce's Ulysses. Is one of the words that accompanies Leopold Bloom, who is the second protagonist of the novel, together with Stephen Dedalus. And Zizek says, talks about the irreducibly antinomic character of our experience of reality. And he says that he theorizes the opening of things, that is, their horizon of meaning, which always also cuts into the field of being themselves, making it incomplete. So this idea of parallax is the way of looking at things with the two eyes, and how vision with one eye covers one aspect and with the other eye covers another aspect, and between them come together and we have the whole. But what Zizek is saying, that this whole always has a little gap in the middle, so that this little gap is what allows things to have their say. Okay, and as I said, the parallax view, it's very much inspired by Joyce Ulysses. So now we move on to the last author that I'm going to be considering here, which is Tom McCarthy's and the short story he wrote for Significant Objects. Significant Objects was a project, an anthropological experiment devised in 2009 by New York Times columnist Rob Walker and editor, writer, and semiotician Joss Glenn. And Glenn had already edited a book entitled Taking Things Seriously, where he had a collection of photographs and essays on objects. And he was describing the unexpected importance of these objects, no? And Walker and Glenn launched this project, Significant Objects, which was aiming to prove that stories associated to objects are a very powerful driver of emotional value. So any object can acquire value through telling. Okay, so what they did is they acquired a series of objects for around $1, and they commissioned some 200 writers to write micro stories about the objects. Well, this you have on your screen some screen captures of the project, which is online. So anyway, after writing the stories, these objects were auctioned in eBay, and they fetch prices that were 10 times the original value. And of course, some of the micro stories were unpublished narratives by well-known authors like William Gibson, Tom McCarthy, or Lydia Millet. So Walker and Glenn gathered around $8,000 in profits, and they shared it among the participant writers, and also they donated it to nonprofit creative organizations. Marmot figurine, which is the example that I want to provide here, is one of the objects in volume 2 of Significant Objects. It's a short story by British novelist Tom McCarthy, and the narrator of the story, which is very short, it has 5 paragraphs. The narrator explains that the object was found in an old bottle washed up in the Dead Horse Bay in Brooklyn. And you will see that many of the expressions in the story echo Joyce's Ulysses. No? So, for example, in the first paragraph, which is they have numbers, the paragraph. So number 1, we have these fragments of text. Pollution of coastal waters can have the black sun of melancholy. Signature of all things I'm here to test. For indicator organisms such as López, Phoebus, Lusignan, or Byron, based on weekly or fortnightly water sampling. So here we have not only the voice of Stephen Dedalus in Ulysses, with the very clear quotation, signature of all things I'm here to read, which was the original in Ulysses, but here is he introduced the voice of Leopold Bloom, which is the second protagonist of Ulysses, and who has a sort of a non-philosophical mind. Is very pragmatic, and he likes astronomy, mathematics, and more scientific pursuits. No, so this part, test for indicator organisms, this is very much an echo of Leopold Bloom in Ulysses. No, so we have the 2 protagonists mixed in these lines. No, and also we have intertextuality. We have the love of Phoebus, which refers to Apollo, and we have Byron mentioned. We have the wine. No? So it's almost like this pollution, he compares it to the water pollution is almost like intertextuality, you know, where we mixed in voices from other texts in literature and echoes from other texts, no? And these literary waters are mentioned by the narrator, are sampled weekly or fortnightly, no? So in other words, McCarthy is reading and he's reading Byron, he's reading myths, mythology, he's reading, of course, Ulysses, and so on. No. By the way, this is the image of the object number 50, and the photo is by a well-known artist, Adrian Kinloch, who actually gave me permission to reproduce the image here and in a paper that I have written about this object. So the second paragraph talks about the beach zone, and again we have many words that echo both Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus, the two protagonists of Ulysses. I have highlighted a few words only. For example, parameter estimation. This will be the kind of language used by Leopold Bloom. And limit of the diaphragm, it's a quotation, direct quotation from the Proteus episode and Stephen Dedalus. So as I said, he's mixing the two positions, almost like looking at both perspectives. No, we must also remember that it's about the story is about a mermaid, no, a siren, no, and the Sirens is an episode in Ulysses. So we begin to have words related to the mermaid in the following paragraphs. No, in the one before, where he's talking about wild sea, money, DC and DT, decay and mixing, language, tide and wind have silted to a build-up of pollutants during the night of the tongues. You who console me. This consoling is referring to the siren, to the mermaid, but the mathematical variables dc and dt are used to measure the speed of certain processes like water deterioration, and they again evoke the practical language of Leopold Bloom. No, while bladder rack it's another term used by Stephen in the Proteus episode, and appears there in paragraph 4. No? The coastline is roughly aligned with the size of the Saint and the cries of prevailing wind positions at this low-on bladder rack in the chambers of pollution forecasting modeled by the grid where wine and rose and mesh. So we also have intertextuality here from Nerval's book Les Chimères, and the story is ending with sarcasm, which is typical of McCarthy's and Joyce's texts as well. No? And he says, 2 brief field studies made to walk on the beach. So in other words, one is given the voice of Stephen Dedalus, and the other one is given the voice of Leopold Bloom. And suddenly we encounter the mermaid, no? At the end, in the last paragraph, in number 5, no? 2 brief field surveys carried out, walk upon the beach, accumulated rainfall and runoff pollution, which is not green, blue, silver, rust, where U is wind and T is days, have modulated on the layer of drainage flow rates, the mermaid singing each to the first flush effect, as visible in figure 3, forehead still red from the Queen's kiss. This is the last paragraph of these very difficult short stories, with many echoes from Ulysses, which again in this paragraph you can see highlighted in black. No, it's not green, blue, silver, and so on. The reference to the mermaid, which is number 11 episode in Ulysses. It takes place at the Ormond Hotel at 4 o'clock, and Leopold Bloom is going there to have a bite to eat. And the chapter is dedicated to sound and music, and it takes the form of a fugue, which is a musical composition. So here in this episode, the sound of things mixes with the human sounds. And these are quotations from the Sirens episodes in Ulysses, no? This rhythm chips, picking chips of rocky thumbnail chips. So, and we have the mermaids, Miss Kennedy and Miss Dawes, which are described as a jumping rose on satiny breast of satin, Rose of Castile, one of them. So this idea of the rose appears also in McCarthy's story. So we have these echoes, no? And because we cannot see the legs of the two waitresses, they are compared to these sirens, no? So in Joyce's episode, Joyce finishes with a coda, which is characteristic of this kind of fugue composition. Bloom breaks wind, adding musicality to the episode. And in the case of McCarthy, he closes with a kiss and a blush, no? Forehead still red from the Queen's kiss, no? The Queen referring to the siren, obviously someone who had been with McCarthy while looking at this place, Dead Horse Bay, no? So my conclusion is that the lecture has been trying to move between these three authors, very complex authors, Pound, Joyce, and McCarthy, in order to explore thinness in modernist and postmodernist writing. And my argument is that the three authors explore a speculative way of writing to investigate textuality in a dialogue with the material agency of objects. So interwoven with echoes from other works, the examples presented invite us to marvel and wonder on how small things can have unexpected meanings with strong emotional imprint. And as a coda to this paper, just a clarification. McCarthy's microstory places its emphasis not so much on the figurine of the mermaid, but on its surroundings. It's a coastal environment where the ornament of the mermaid has probably been thrown into the sea as waste, and it's an environment where natural beauty coexists alongside pollution and destruction, death, no? As we were looking at the Proteus episode. So Dead Horse Bay was used since the 19th century as New York City dump, and the name refers to the remains and carcasses of dead horses. So thank you very much, and I would like to finish with drawing attention to thinness in relation to sustainability. So stay sustainable. Thank you very much.